Well, tonight's topic is generally not one of the audience favorites, but as I'm doing a sort of series of talks which lead gradually from the more mundane to the more transcendental, somewhere along the line, one has to mention intoxicants. And the previous blessing in the sequence, number 19, talked about temptations generally, and temptations there were the sort which you can probably picture quite easily, and then the more subtle ones which reside in the mind, some of which are like hindrances in meditation, some of which are more subtle than that still. But I did mention last time that most of the temptations I talked about are still quite easy adversaries when compared to the sort of temptations that also have a physical dependency involved with them. So just to say no to something that is tempting your mind is pretty easy compared with something that your body also has a craving for. And this is why probably intoxicants have been given their own special blessing completely, because the sort of strategies and determination you need to overcome them is maybe of a different sort of magnitude. And going back 20 odd years when I was a young monk, sent freshly to convert the heathens in Belgium at the time, the policy of the temple was just teach people meditation. You don't need to go into Buddhist culture and other connected things like that. Just teach them meditation and they will know for themselves what to do. So I followed the policy at the time, and we had some very strange sort of meditation experiences coming back from the audiences there. And they were telling me things like, well, I can see a crystal ball inside, but it's spinning the whole of the time. Like I can't keep it still at all. I thought, well, this is really strange. I've been in Thailand for years and never heard these sorts of experiences for meditation. So once I got to know this sort of particular sector of the audience better, it turns out that every evening after the meditation class, they all went to the pub together. And they got fairly sort of out of it. So it wasn't a great surprise that like mixing two things together ended up with some pretty strange and unstable, you might say, meditation experiences. So these days, at least down on level 20 of the blessings, then one has to come across some of the Western values concerning alcohol and intoxicants generally, which sometimes are a little bit out of step with the values which generally are associated with a meditating culture. So, contrary to the general logic of the West, which is generally quite permissive towards alcohol consumption, because it's associated with relaxation and celebration, most Westerners would generally balk at any suggestion that alcohol is destructive. However, the statistics, and I got the UK ones for you especially, tell a different story. And maybe because of the lockdown, but the number of deaths caused annually in the UK is up to 9,000 a year, where alcohol consumption has contributed to the cause of death. Alcohol misuse is the biggest risk factor for death, ill health, disability amongst 15 to 49-year-olds in the UK, and 39% of violent crime is linked with the influence of alcohol in England, and in Scotland it is worse. Furthermore, there's an estimated 30% of UK families have been intimately exposed to violence. They cited the effects of alcohol abuse as the cause. So this is like domestic violence mostly, The annual cost of crime and antisocial behavior, this is normally where politicians actually sit up and listen instead of counting the taxes they get in from alcohol sales. Cost of crime and antisocial behavior from alcohol misuse is 7.3 billion annually. And more than 21,000 children are born annually in the UK to drinking mothers who have mental and physical deficiencies, or FASD as it's called, as a result of their exposure to alcohol in utero. So you might ask how it got this way. Relaxation, celebration. Ironically, a lot of the sort of permissiveness actually has a sort of scriptural, at least from the Bible, provenance. The Mass or the Eucharist, depending on what sort of Christian you are, actually involves alcohol. And the seriousness of alcohol problems seems to have been accelerated by distillation of liquor products, and research going back to as early as 1813 have actually established a connection between alcohol consumption, liver disease, jaundice, wasting, mental dysfunction. In Christian circles, opposition and also permissiveness have come depending on what denomination you're looking at. Actually, it's Methodist values that, backed by clinical research, that led to the American prohibition, going back to 1920 to 1933 in the States. But at the same time, in the Bible, the alcohol is seen as something which is good for those of heavy hearts, to let them drink and forget their poverty, remember their misery no more, which comes from Proverbs. So there is this sort of undertone of alcohol being sort of all right, and it's just like a few obnoxious individuals who make a problem out of it. But these days, especially at a time when we're at a turning point in things like legalization of recreational use of things like cannabis, vaping, return to public spaces, people spending lockdown with a cocktail in their hand, perhaps more than for the other blessings with studies, then the Westerners will find the Buddhist teachings go against the grain of accepted social norms. And although we might hide behind phrases like drinking responsibly, from the point of view of Buddhists, unless you're planning on drinking milk responsibly, there's no really such thing as drinking responsibly. So, what do the Buddhists say? We encountered abstinence from drinking alcohol at various stages in the blessings we have already studied. We've met them in the Roads to Ruin, Blessing 6, 7, 13, 14, as a fifth precept in Blessing 9. And also we have met it up with it as wrong livelihood in trading in Blessing 18. The Buddha devotes the entire blessing to it in this particular blessing, not because it's the damage it does just to your physical health, but also if you don't abstain from alcohol at this particular point in your sort of spiritual development, then it's very hard to see how you can upgrade yourself in the direction of Blessing 21 on avoiding recklessness in the Dharma or any of the virtues more subtle than this. So if you consider self-discipline based on the 5 precepts, then you find that most of them are more or less independent from one another, except for the 5th one, because it sort of compromises your ability to use your conscience to the full. For the great abbot of Wat Phra Nam, the founder of our particular tradition, he compared the precepts, the 5 precepts, to an elephant with 4 feet and a trunk. 5 precepts, 4 legs and a trunk. And he said that the first four precepts, not killing, stealing, engaging in sexual misconduct, or telling lies, would be equivalent to the 4 feet of an elephant, but the trunk would be equivalent to the 5th precept. And you might cut a leg off an elephant, and it would probably still get by. But if you cut off its trunk, then it's pretty hard to see how it can survive at all. And it's much the same with the rest of the 5 precepts, which tend to go down in full if you miss the final one. So it is seen as the most crucial in the teachings of the Pramongkun Tepani, who is the founder of our Dhammakaya tradition. Alcohol seems pretty bad, but there's worse, and it comes in the form of drug addiction of various sorts. Because even if you try to help a person addicted to drugs with sympathy and sentimentality, a bleeding heart approach will almost certainly come back to bite you. And the first you know about it is when you start getting stolen from, for example, and later you will end up getting emotionally hurt, and you might lose your faith in humanity generally. There was someone in a PBS documentary once discussing heroin, and they said, the first time you shoot up, you may as well just go out there and rent yourself a removals van, so U-Haul in the United States. Bring it to your place, load it up with all your stuff, your house, your girlfriend, your friends, and everything. You might as well lose all that stuff up front, get it over with, because guaranteed you will eventually lose all that stuff, one way or another. You may think you won't, but no one gets out unscathed. It's just a matter of time. So it could be any Class A substance, or it might be any one of the sort of so-called gateway drugs that lead down that path. And friendship and sympathy, although that's our usual way to engage with people, it just doesn't help the situation. So, the trouble with alcohol is that it affects the mind. And we all know that the mind is pretty hard to train, even on the best of days. And if there's alcohol also in the mix, then all the usual habits of the mind, which we try really hard to control anyway, will really take root and be out of control. So being habituated to unwholesome thinking, for example, sometimes the mind has been compared to a fish out of water. Whenever it is deprived of sort of unwholesome habits, it will fight for its life to get back to them. And if alcohol is in the mix as well, then that struggle is all the more aggressive. The mind is pretty fickle at the best of times and tends to change continuously, but if it's under the influence of alcohol, then that changeability will be even more dramatic. Mind has a tendency to wander. We're trying to bring it back when we're meditating the whole of the time. It's pretty hard to keep the mind on one single thing, and that is even worse under the influence of alcohol. And it's pretty hard to pacify the mind, and it's just like throwing fuel on the fire if one is under the influence. So you might say, well, we don't drink, so we are never drunk. The Buddha went further to say that there's drunkenness even without drinking alcohol that we all suffer from anyway. And it's a sort of overconfidence concerning life, which makes us as good as drunk in many cases, especially concerning the everlasting nature of our youth. We tend to think, I can still go out every night, I'm still young, I'm still beautiful, I can still turn the heads of the youngsters. But really that is a form of drunkenness, according to the Buddha. We tend to think we'll always be disease-free, stay healthy forever, abusing our health doesn't really matter. And we tend to be unrealistic about the length of our lives, telling everyone or telling ourselves that the likes of us doesn't die so easily. So the Buddha called all such attitudes drunkenness. So even without drinking alcohol, people still think like this. So you can imagine how much worse it's going to get to see through to the truth of life if you are not fully aware. So some Buddhists say, well, the Buddha was really only talking about distilled alcohol. So what exactly is being talked about here in the case of intoxicants? Now, can you have wine gums? Can you have root beer? Can you have kombucha? What exactly does it refer to? The Buddha used the word majjapana to refer to anything that's absorbable by the body that clouds the mind. In general, it means alcohol, so that's either distilled or fermented, but it also refers to other substances like tobacco and addictive non-medicinal drugs. It can also mean liquids that are drunk or injected or inhaled, or dried substances that are smoked. The word sanyamo, which is the other part of the blessing in the Pali language used in alcohol, literally speaking means being careful with regard to. And being careful of intoxicating substances doesn't just mean using these things with care. It means, in normal circumstances, it would mean total abstention. But unlike some religions where you're not even allowed to get a whiff of the stuff, in exceptional circumstances, alcohol is a component used for medical purposes. You heard of that? So Buddhism doesn't prohibit alcohol per se, but it might be used for cleaning a wound, preserving a corpse, or as a component of let's say, traditional medicines for indigestion. But the idea is to use it to cure a particular symptom, not to have more alcohol than medicine in the bottle. Yeah. So some people know that drugs like opiates are dangerous, but they may be useful for medicinal purposes. So the question generally is to go with prescription advice, and that would be called being careful with regard to. Yeah? Problems with alcohol. Got some fun pictures from Prohibition era. Visible this lifetime, it will destroy your wealth, friendship, health, reputation, honor, and intelligence. So, do I need to explain more about that? Unfortunately, many of the things it does in this lifetime actually carry over into future lifetimes as well, if you want to read up on it. Speech impediments, you can imagine people speaking with slurred speech, people who behave in a crazy way, people who don't seem to be living up to their full intelligence, people who have to crawl home, or as they say, go by rail, go by the railings along the front of their house, go home by rail. Actually, next lifetime, instead of just being a passing phase that ends with a hangover, it ends up being your permanent state of being. So that is why the Buddha did not recommend it. And as a final cautionary tale, I will leave you with something called the Bhadraghata Jātaka, Jātaka number 291. You remember a rich merchant called Anathapindika, perhaps, if you heard some of my previous stories? One of the main supporters of the Buddha in those times. He had problems with a few of his relatives. Back in Blessing 12, we had the story about how he bribed his son to go to the temple. Maybe you can remember that? Well, he had a few other dysfunctional members of his own family. And as usual, he tried to help them with compassion as far as was possible. And he had another nephew who had squandered 40 million of the family's fortune on his drinking habits. And he has still ended up penniless. So the said nephew turned up uninvited at Anathapindika's house, asking for some financial help. Just the favorite sort of relatives who you hate to be visited by. So the nephew claimed that he would use the money that he was given to him to invest in business and to set himself up in life, turn his life around. So Anathapindika, in his usual characteristic compassionate style, was pleasantly surprised to hear his drunken nephew wanted to earn his living for a change. So, as a good example of the 3 strikes rule for helping extended family in Buddhism that we've already seen in Blessing 17, Anathapindika agreed to help his nephew out by giving him 1,000 and taught him a few tricks of the trade. So the nephew thanked him very much and wasted no time in going out and spending all the money on booze. And later, he came back again to Anathapindika and he said he'd lost all the money he'd been given in business due to a lack of experience and asked for money again. So, number 2, twice. So Anathapindika pretended he didn't know what was going on, but this time he gave the nephew only 500. The first time 1,000, second time 500, telling him to invest it wisely. So this is compassion for you at this stage. So the shameless nephew spent the 500 again on alcohol, and then went back a third time to Anathapindika asking for more money. And this time, instead of giving him money, Anathapindika gave him 2 pieces of cloth, knowing that the nephew at least would have to expend some effort in selling the stuff in order to get money out of it. And the nephew did sell the cloth, but again he spent all the money he earned from the sale on alcohol again. And he came back to Anathapindika for a 4th time with an outstretched palm. And this time Anathapindika had him thrown out on the street. So 3 times, 3 strikes, 4th time. And the nephew was now destitute and couch-surfed with everyone he could think of until he eventually died in poverty. And at that point, when Anathapindika heard the news, he felt a pang of shame, and he had himself to blame for his nephew's death. And he wondered, was there something more he could have done? So he went to see the Buddha, and he told the Buddha the whole story. And the Buddha said that it was not only in this lifetime that the nephew had been beyond help. And even in a previous lifetime, the nephew had been given a wish-fulfilling cup, so a sort of cup that you could wish for anything you like and it would appear in the cup. He'd had one of these things and he'd still messed it up. He couldn't satiate his appetite for alcohol. So it was no surprise that even with Anathapindika's limited means, he couldn't help the person who was so addicted in this way. So even though Anathapindika's nephew had had the chance to help himself with free handouts from the millionaire, as a drunk he didn't lift a finger to help himself, and for that reason you could say he was beyond help. Therefore, before helping someone, sometimes it's necessary to see whether they're going to use the money you give them to buy alcohol. Sometimes the more you give them, the more it will destroy them. So this is why it's important to have a sense of being level-headed, or in Buddhism sometimes it's known by the sort of technical word of equanimity, to sort of see in a very balanced way where the best help, the best way forward to give help should be applied when helping others in society. Yeah. So to finish off with a few little announcements. I encourage you to meditate further at home if you don't do already, and usually 20 minutes a day is a good place to start for those who are new to meditation, to try to build up a daily habit. Meditating in the morning, meditating in the evening, meditating at the time of day, which is the time when you are least likely to be interrupted. And little by little, then you will see progress. Sometimes you may have good days, sometimes you might have bad days, but on aggregate, then generally you will see an improvement if you can manage to keep it up on a daily basis. If you get a little bit vague about how exactly to meditate, then these days they have a thing called Mind Gem that you can download onto your mobile phone, and it has lots of audio tracks, constantly increasing number of audio tracks from various teachers in our tradition to lead you through your meditation, also with a timer to set to wake you up or whatever at the end, wake you from your meditation. Here in Woking, we have class every Tuesday evening with the meditation a little bit shorter, 30 minutes worth. Every Thursday, 45 minutes worth of meditation, followed by a talk. And I'd like to say that coming up on the 23rd of October, we are hoping to organize our Katina ceremony for this year. Anyone's interested in more details, they have a little brochure which is now in English. You have to make sure you get the one that's in English, because some have got Thai on both sides, or English and Thai for everything else. Yes, so there's one that explains itself. But basically, if you'd like to participate, come along, attend. You can volunteer to help with the preparation, running and clearing up afterwards if you have some extra free time. And also you can donate for the Katina ceremony, because this year we're hoping to construct 2 extra little annexes onto this building at the front area, filling it out a little bit at the front. One side will be as a reception area, and the other side will be for putting noisy children in. Yes. Online, we still have the remnant of the pandemic. We have the DMEU, or the European Meditation Together, between 7 and 8 every Saturday, with the English-speaking teachers around the continent chipping in each week. And next full moon meditation coming up in October, with the theme of the end of Buddhist Lent, will be on Tuesday the 11th of October, where there's a candle lighting activity along with the usual meditation and talk.